Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History by Podcast. Today I'm live with Dr. Dan McClellan. And I just also want to say a little hello to Dan's audience as well, since we're also streaming over there. And tonight we're going to be talking a bit about what do scholars know about the historical Jesus? What kind of methodology do scholars employ to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus as best as they can? And with that being said, thank you for joining me today, Dan.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate your time.
And likewise, thank you. Yeah, so I really want to pull this up real quick. This is from Captain Dadpool. If Jesus was a historic figure, why are there no marble sculptures of him from the first century? Checkmate, historicist. That's hilarious.
I think that kind of gets at some of the misinformation that we get from the mythicist crowd that expects Jesus as this monumentally influential figure to have been memorialized in some way, shape, or form, that we should have something that's preserved, some kind of material data that's preserved. But he was not even if you follow the Gospels as historical documents, he was not particularly well known until after his death. And the reconstruction of the historical Jesus that most scholars agree on doesn't really have him being particularly noteworthy during his life at all. And for this time and place, we have like 99.99% of the people who lived in first century CE Judea, we have absolutely nothing on them. Even some of the most important people who had sovereignty over that region or who were had authority within that region, we know literally nothing about them. We have no material evidence. So I think that's Captain Dadpool is his old hat for him, but that's kind of poking fun at the expectation that we have marble statues created of Jesus during his lifetime or something.
So what do scholars employ to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus? On the one hand, we have Paul, who is the earliest of them, of the bunch in the New Testament. And he doesn't really say much about Jesus except that he was crucified and a couple other details, but it's not really much to go on. But you got the Gospels coming in later, which they have a lot more to say about Jesus, but they're writing many decades after Jesus' death. So what do scholars do to sort that material out and to determine this thing over here, this part of the gospel over here might be more likely historically correct, and this part of it over here not so much? How's that work?
So the methodologies have shifted over the years as scholars have aimed at different things with their work, trying to figure different things out. A lot of this scholarship began centuries ago, just presupposing that it was all historical, and then there was a lot of work trying to line up what people were pulling out of the ground, the material archaeological data that we were recovering, with what was in the Gospels. And that's where we had to start retreating to, okay, well, this doesn't seem to work very well. And what about this? What about this other thing over here? And it would be nice if we had direct archaeological evidence or some kind or another, but we really don't, apart from these texts. We have Paul, as you mentioned, which is the earliest. His earliest writing, probably First Thessalonians, maybe possibly late 30s, but more likely in the 40s CE. So probably a decade after Jesus's death, but that's the closest. And then we have the Gospels, and then we have some later references: Josephus, Tacitus. We have Pliny. We have some references coming from the early 2nd century CE. And really, the best that scholars can hope to do is look at all of the data that we do have and try to figure out what is the most likely set of scenarios that result in the data being as we have them. And whether that means a historical Jesus or not a historical Jesus, everything needs to be on the table in that initial kind of foray into these textual data. And what the overwhelming majority of scholars, in fact, virtually every last scholar who specializes in this region and this time period, thinks that what is most likely, given the textual data, is that there was a person who was probably an itinerant apocalyptic Jewish preacher from Galilee who preached about the end times and probably caused some kind of disturbance in the Jerusalem temple around Passover and earned execution at the hands of the Roman state for his troubles. And then his followers started trying to pick up the pieces of this tradition following his death. And we try to look for there's a long history of coming up with criteria that we might use to apply to different parts of the text. You have the criterion of embarrassment. So, for instance, if we look in the Gospels and there's some passage that, based on what we understand about the first Christians, they probably would have been a little embarrassed to mention this. And so the idea is that makes it more likely than not that they felt pressured to include it because it pre-existed their text. It probably goes back to a very early tradition. You have multiple attestation, where you have stories that are represented across multiple different sources. And, people will talk about the Gospels as all coming from one source, but we do have indications that the Gospels are drawing from multiple different sources. Mark is got some source for his text. You've got Matthew and Luke. They both are pulling some from Mark, and then they each have their own kind of independent source, and then they might be sharing another source that is not Mark. So you've got a handful of different sources that these authors seem to be pulling from, and those sources predate the Gospels, and using a variety of different methodologies and means, which frequently have some assumption that go along with them. You can date some of these sources back into the 50s or maybe even the 40s. And I think Bart Ehrman has even argued there are some sources that he suggests go back to the 30s CE. So once you're within a few years of Jesus's death, these traditions seem likely to be based at least on a living person rather than just fabricated, rather than just being invented ex nihilo by someone who's just trying to gin up a following or gin up some kind of cult or something like that. And there's a new book that has just come out about the new quest for the historical Jesus, which gathers I think a couple dozen different scholars who are working on historical Jesus to talk about how a lot of these criteria aren't satisfactory anymore, and what it means to search for the historical Jesus at this point. Because most scholars now would say, we're pretty sure that there was a historical Jesus, but we don't think we can take anything in the gospel, any of the letters in red, and actually say we're confident this goes back to a historical Jesus. We're at a point now where it's like we can't really say much more than there was probably an itinerant apocalyptic preacher from Galilee who was executed by Rome.
Does Papias of Hierapolis talk about any of our synoptic gospels? And does he, what the multiple logios or logoi he seems to be talking about in the fragments of his work that survive, does that give some indication of awareness of pre-Markan sources?
I personally, I don't think so. I think this is Papias talks about receiving basically oral testimony from others, and he talks about a presbyter that some people identify as the beloved disciple, the author of the Gospel of John. I think critical scholars would say that's unlikely. This is somebody who claims to have been a disciple of one of the early disciples. There's a reference to Matthew having written a gospel in Hebrew, but the Gospel of Matthew was not originally written in Hebrew. It shows no indications of translation into Greek. And so that's, I don't personally think that is the Gospel of Matthew as we have it today. Could it be a version of Matthew that was in circulation that people just assumed it was originally translated from Hebrew? Possibly. Could it be something else going on? Like it's supposed to be a sayings gospel. You mentioned logia. That is obviously not what we have in the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew has a narrative framework. It is not a sayings gospel like we might find in the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Mark is also mentioned. Mark, being the interpreter of Peter, says he said it all in in not good order. That was Papias's criticism. There are scholars who suggest that this is indicative of, again, some other text that's not Mark. Maybe some apologists would say an early draft of Mark. Others would say this is some other text that we don't know about. I don't know that we could extrapolate from what Papias is talking about that there are pre-Markan sources that have been lost to us. It's certainly possible, but I think most scholars would say what Papias is talking about is probably something approximating one of our gospels, or maybe just something that's that never existed at all. But yeah, I think his reference to Mark is probably a little more secure than his reference to Matthew. But if he was referring to the gospels that we have today, I think it was probably some other version of them rather than pre-Markan gospel sources that later got confused for Mark and Matthew.
So how do scholars try to sort out the details in the Gospels? But specifically, what I'm asking is, some might try to take the angle of trying to recover the Jewish elements of Jesus, look for anything that resembles Judaism, perhaps Torah orthodoxy within his sayings, teachings, and then use that to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus and try to delineate it from Hellenism, or try to separate those parts from the Hellenistic aspects. What are your thoughts on that?
I think usually when that happens, they're relying on rabbinic literature to fill in a lot of those gaps, and that's coming from probably a century or more after the life of Jesus. And so I think it's not an incredibly secure foundation on which to try to build this reconstruction. And at the same time, again, if we're talking about the rhetoric that we find in the Gospels, there's talk about Jesus appealing to some of the rabbinic conventional exegetical and rhetorical patterns and things like that. That's the work of the authors of the Gospels. We can't just presuppose that we have verbatim accounts of precisely Jesus's words. And so I don't think that's a strong foundation on which to build a reconstruction of the historical Jesus. But it's, there's not much else that we have to go on. And so I think there's a lot more reconstructing of early first century CE Judea and Galilee that we would need to do before we could start trying to line up what we find in the Gospels with what we understand of Judaism from that time period. And I think the distinction of Judaism and Hellenism is a false dichotomy. I think there is it's more of a Greco-Roman Judaism. I think there's quite a bit of integration and overlap in the Greco-Roman world, in the Hellenistic world, and what we have in Judaism. These were not entirely incommensurate social identities or cultures. I think there was a lot of mixing going on. Jesus was raised in, probably born, and at least was raised in Nazareth, which is just over the hill from a Greco-Roman metropolis of sorts. And so I think there's little chance that there was not quite a bit of Greco-Roman influence going on. And there are a lot of researchers today who are, the pendulum swung in the direction of, we got to do Hellenism, and then it's like, no, we got to do Judaism. And now I think we're trying to level things off a little bit with a recognition that these were not two completely separate culture identities. There was quite a bit of overlap.
So with Mark as the first gospel, is it also attempted to just look at Mark like, okay, Mark is the earliest of the gospels, and therefore one should try to look there first to try to reconstruct Jesus, and then look at Matthew and Luke a little later?
I think there's a degree to which we might think of Mark as the closest to the sources, but the sources are not necessarily Jesus's life. The sources are the things that come in between Jesus's death and Mark. And so I think we can talk about Mark as probably closer to the sources than the other Gospels, but the other Gospels had their own sources as well, which may come from an earlier time than what we have in Mark. So I tend to think, when people talk about the Gospel of John and they'll say, oh, well, Jesus did this, but it's only in John. It's like, well, John's likely the least historical of all of the Gospels, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there is nothing in John that could come from a pre-Markan source. It just means that on the whole, John takes the most liberties. But again, frequently when we talk about Mark adopting some source or tradition that predates Mark, it may only be 5 years, it may be 10 years, it could be 30 years. It doesn't necessarily mean that's what the actual historical Jesus experienced or said or anything like that. A lot of traditions would have developed in the years after Jesus's death, which would predate any of the texts that we have in the Bible, but still wouldn't be historical. And I think a lot of scholars are finally, after so many years of grappling with the complexity of this, are starting to be more honest and more open about just how complex it is, trying to reconstruct something that, our earliest traditions may just go back to something somebody recalled, whether historical or not, 5 years after Jesus's death. And that's probably not going to be incredibly reliable for folks who are looking to reconstruct the historical Jesus today.
So I'd like to ask you about these other sources that you're talking about. And I'm assuming these include Q, M, and L, but also the Gospel of John being written in multiple stages. Because it was, I know that several Johannine scholars believe that the Gospel of John was edited heavily and then kind of compressed and put together at a later stage.
Yeah, I think when we talk about M and L, those would be the sources that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke consulted that were independent of, one, the Gospel of Mark, and then two, whatever source Matthew and Luke may have shared between the two of them. They may both have relied on. That would be Q in those reconstructions. However, not all scholars agree that there was a Q. Some scholars suggest that Luke depended on Matthew as one of that author's sources. And so where Luke agrees with Matthew, it's not because they shared a source, it's because one of them used the other as a source. So there are a few different theories that account for why we find stuff in Matthew and Luke that is shared between the two of them, but is not in Mark. And then we have the stuff that's only in Matthew, that would be M, and the stuff that's only in Luke, that would be L. And these would be considered distinct, separate sources. And when we kind of tease apart all the different parts of the Gospels, we have a variety of different sayings and narratives that probably go back to traditions that arose following the death of Jesus. And John is, there are a handful of indications that John has some editorial layers and a thick shellacking of editorializing. For instance, the very last chapter toward the end, we have the statement, these are the words of the disciple, and we know that his testimony is true. And if you're paying close attention, you might be wondering, who's we? This is supposed to be the account of the beloved disciple, and then you've got this plural third party who chimes in to say, yeah, we know this is all true. And which raises the question, where does their involvement stop and start? What layer is that? Is that the entire last chapter? Does it start right at that verse? Or are they popping in throughout the gospel with their little chime-ins? And there are a handful of other indications of this. You have toward the end of the gospel, they're at the Last Supper, and Jesus is like, all right, let's get out of here. And then you have like 2 chapters of Jesus sermonizing, and then the next chapter starts, so they got out of there. And it's like, well, it certainly seems like the story originally had Jesus say, well, let's get out of here, so they got out of there. And then somebody was like, nah, I'm going to jam a bunch of stuff right in between there. You've got another part of John where he's in Jerusalem and he finishes up sermonizing in Jerusalem, and then the very next verse says, "Then they crossed over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee." It's like, hey, now that's like 100 miles away, and you haven't the narrative hasn't taken us there, and so there are a handful of pretty sharp editorial seams in the Gospel of John that are indicative of a rapid editorializing where people did not have time to go through and smooth off some of these rough edges, leaving some of these indications that that this gospel has come together in fits and starts, and I think that's one of the indications that we're dealing with a less careful consideration of the sources, and probably authors and editors who are more concerned for serving their own rhetorical needs, whether that means slapping on a handful of chapters of discourse or altering the narrative to get rid of stuff that they don't like or whatever.
So, what do scholars feel comfortable saying? Okay, we know this thing about Jesus is most likely true, other than just saying his name was Yeshua and he was crucified under Pontius Pilate sometime in the 30 CE.
There's not a lot, but I think that Jesus was from Nazareth. The idea that he came from a family of some type of crafts person, whether a stonemason or whatever, that is generally accepted as probably going back to stories from his life or very shortly after. The idea that he had about a 1-year ministry, that he was not there for long, that he probably did cause some kind of disturbance in the temple that resulted in probably Roman soldiers coming in, or at least a big enough disturbance to put Jesus on Rome's radar. And they probably tracked him down, perhaps in the Garden of Gethsemane. Maybe the reason that all of the Gospels share that detail is because that goes back to a historical memory. That's probably what resulted in his execution. Not everybody wanting to make him king, not the triumphal entry, not all of this stuff, but causing a disturbance in the temple during the Passover week probably would have been seen as trying to foment rebellion, which would have been tried and prosecuted, as sedition, which is one of the short list of things that would have merited death by execution by crucifixion. So, just him being like, I'm king of the Jews, Rome wouldn't have been like, oh yeah, string him up, we got to crucify this guy. That was something that would have been reserved for sedition, rebellion. Banditry was usually also included within that umbrella of things. So I think the end of his life, some of those stories probably have more of a ring of history than some of the stories about his travels and his sermons and things like that. Probably was someone who, if not an ascetic, at least was anti-Roman to some degree, preached the coming of the kingdom of God. Whether or not Jesus had anything to say about the Son of Man or identified with the Son of Man, I don't know that we can be confident about that. I'm not positive Jesus was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. I think an awful lot of scholars, I don't know about it, the majority, but an awful lot of scholars would probably say that he would have been buried in a pauper's grave or in a mass grave or something like that. That would have been standard for that kind of execution. But I don't know. And whether or not people, I think it's likely historical that people claim to have seen the risen Jesus. But those kinds of claims and accounts and experiences are not incredibly uncommon when people who are oppressed, or people who are desperate, or people who are bereaved find themselves in situations where that's helpful for their negotiating with these circumstances. So I think it's probably likely that there were accounts of Jesus appearing to people that popped up shortly after his death and began to circulate. And the further they circulated, the more confidence people had when they repeated the stories. So, but yeah, I'm sure there's more that people could say. A great book on, well, I've heard from other scholars who specialize in this field that it's not a great book, but Jesus Before the Gospels is a book that Bart Ehrman wrote that incorporates social memory theory into a discussion about what we might be able to recover, where Bart talks about the difference between memories that are likely later creations, and then what he calls gist memories, social memories that get the gist of what historically happened. But for someone trying to look at what kind of evidence we can piece together about the historical Jesus, I think that is it's a wonderful book to read, just to get some exposure to that kind of research.
Yep. So, would you say that Jesus might have been, based on some of the disturbances, and obviously that he was crucified, that he was viewed as some type of rebel? Was he? And if he was sort of a rebel, and I'm not necessarily referring to the zealot hypothesis,
Mm-hmm.
but if he was a kind of rebel, what do you think his goal might have been in rebellion? What did he want?
I imagine that he was, if not confident that God would be swooping down, would peel back the fabric of reality to swoop down and destroy the Romans, maybe he thought he could arrange the meeting. Maybe he thought he could catalyze this. There is a theory that Judas, in the Gospel of Mark at least, is not presented as somebody who's inspired by Satan and who was betraying Jesus, but someone who was doing something very similar. We need to get the show on the road. I think if I arrange for this confrontation, that's going to force Jesus's hand, and then that will set things off. But it ends up causing Jesus to be crucified. That's one theory about what was going on with Jesus. Judas. Maybe the historical Jesus was trying to do something very similar. Go stick his thumb in Rome's eye and hope that catalyzed God's return. There's a lot of apocalyptic literature from around this time period where that's kind of the idea. You have like Daniel, you have the whole "but if not" stuff. We're going to put our lives on the line, and God will save us. But if not, and then you have like Second Maccabees 7 and 8. These stories about these martyrs who sacrificed themselves in the face of Seleucid oppression. So I imagine Jesus probably was doing something very similar. Just got a bee in his bonnet and was like, "Hey, we've had enough of these. The Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea are not getting the job done. So I'm going to go cause a disturbance in the temple, and hopefully that will cause God to swoop down." And unfortunately, much like the love interest in oh gosh, I forgot the name of the movie. Braveheart. In Braveheart, where she's up there looking across the hillside for where her lover is going to come galloping to save her. Nobody comes to save him, and he gets executed. I think that's probably about as sound a reconstruction of what was going on in Jesus's head as we can do with the available data.
Do you think historically that Jesus faced opposition from both Jews that disagreed with him and obviously Romans? Kind of like what Josephus seems to suggest in the Testimonium, that he had faced opposition from both simultaneously.
Oh, I have no doubt, because there would have been a whole spectrum of approaches to dealing with Roman oppression within Judaism, from the Zealots to the Sadducees to the Pharisees and the separatists like the Essenes. So there would have been a wide variety of approaches, and people would have been critical of the approaches that they didn't like. Just like today, there are a wide variety of different ways that people are going about trying to engage each other on some of the social ills that are going on, and you have a lot of critique and criticism and even violence that comes not only from the ideological other, but even from within organizations, where part of the organization thinks that the methods of the other part aren't productive enough or aren't radical enough or something like that. So within the Judaism in this time period, which was characterized more by pluriformity than any kind of consistency, I think absolutely there would have been those among the Jewish folks who would have been telling him to sit down and shut up. And another feature of the historical Jesus's life that has a ring of historicity to it, it's not unlikely that Rome enlisted the aid of some of their own, not their own folks on the inside, but some of their confidential informants among the leadership within Jerusalem and Judea among the Jewish folks. I have no doubt that there probably would have been those who would have been informing on Jesus to Rome and would have been acting as agents of Rome in that.
I'd now like to shift to Tacitus and what Tacitus says about Christus. He associates the Christians with the fire of Rome, and he seems to be the earliest source and the only one around his time that does that. What are your thoughts on that? Is Tacitus reliable here?
I think Tacitus is probably passing on what he has heard. I think he attributes the blaming of the fire on Christians to Nero. It's been a while since I've looked at that text, but if I recall, he says that he's our source for the notion that Nero blamed the fire on Christians. But I'd have to revisit that source. Obviously, Tacitus is getting it from somewhere, and it does not seem to be from the gospel accounts or anything like that. This seems to be something coming from outside the Christian community that Tacitus is repeating. And how far back those sources go, they probably are contemporaneous or shortly after the 60s CE. So I don't know how far we can press Tacitus's account, but I think that it's not. I don't think it's a fabrication on Tacitus's part. I think he's working with sources that he received, and he's doing his best to try to use them to reconstruct what seems to have been going on. Because I think he's also where we get the idea of Nero using the corpses of Christians to light his garden at night. I think that's a reference that's made by Tacitus, who obviously didn't think very highly of Nero, but also didn't seem to think very highly of the Christians. And some folks like to make a lot of the spelling Crestus and Christians, which is a Latin transliteration, but that's also which would be I think it would be in the Greek. It would come not from the iota, but the eta. But that's actually a spelling that we have in like Codex Sinaiticus that was later corrected. But that seems to have been one of the alternative spellings of Christian and Christ that was in circulation at the time period. So I think the folks that think this is Tacitus referring to some other messianic figure who went by the name Useful or something like that, I think that's making too much of that alternative spelling.
All right, I'm going to take some super chat questions.
Yeah.
I'm going to pull this one up. I don't know how you're going to feel about this one, but this is from Sean. Is Numbers 31, 15, 18 about intercourse slavery?
I think it is concubinage. This has to do with the taking of virgin women in battle and taking them, the soldiers taking them for themselves. So I think the idea there is concubinage, or to be more a more vulgar term, sex slavery.
Brian West, thank you for your super chat. Dan, doesn't Bart E believe in a historic Jesus, but no details about him?
But Bart absolutely believes in a historical Jesus. Goes so far to say that we can be certain that there was a historical Jesus, and he published his own book on this in 2012 or 2013 called "Did Jesus?" It's either "Did Jesus really exist?" or "Did Jesus exist?" I don't remember on the top of my head, but that's a pretty good discussion that goes into detail and takes seriously the "Did Jesus exist?" from 2012. That takes the mythicist position seriously. He does not believe that we can reconstruct an awful lot of actual sayings of Jesus, but I do think he thinks the Gospels preserve some accurate details about some of the events and teachings of Jesus. So he's not quite as agnostic regarding the events of Jesus's life as some other scholars are.
What do you think about the idea that Jesus was an apocalyptic preacher?
I think it makes sense. The message that we're getting is overwhelmingly about the coming kingdom of God, which at the time would have been understood by most as delivery of the Judean people from oppression at the hands of Rome, which would have been, and we see this in some of the texts from Qumran and elsewhere, where there's this great grand final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and God is going to come deliver everybody. And the book of Daniel, that was what they thought was going on in the 160s BCE with Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, and the idea was all of this coming to a head, and it's all about to end. And I think you see the same going on in the early first century CE. Now, I think things get a lot worse, get a lot more acute in the 60s CE. So after Jesus's death, particularly as we're ramping up for Rome attacking, laying siege to Jerusalem, and we have the Jewish War that goes from about 66 to about 70 CE. I think things are much more acute there, and so I imagine that the authors who are writing the Gospels shortly after this are using that. That's kind of the inspiration for the characters that or I imagine that is there's an awful lot of gravitational pull in the direction of that kind of apocalyptic looking event, which they probably aligned with what was the book of Daniel and what they were expecting with Antiochus the Fourth Epiphany. So I think it makes sense of what was going on with people who were styling themselves as messiahs in this time and place. Jesus was not the first person to claim to be the Messiah in first century CE Judea. There were a handful of others, and they all met similar fates. But for whatever reason, their followings did not survive long after their own deaths. And so I think it fits with the apocalyptic imagination and the apocalyptic kind of genre of preaching that was going on in that time and place.
Nathaniel Alpern, thank you for your super chat. When you look online, ESV and NASB are word for word than in NRSV and NIV. What does this mean if NRSV is the most historically accurate?
I'm not a huge fan of this word for word versus thought for thought dichotomy. Every translation is thought for thought. A literal word for word translation is just a reproduction of the source text. Interlinears can't even be word for word. They're going to use one word in place of two or more, or they're going to use two or more words in place of one. All of them are thought for thought. It's a question of the degree to which they try to preserve the form of the source text. And I think it's a bit of a fallacy to think that actually increases the transferal of meaning, because all it really does is render in a less familiar and a less native form the text in the target language. So I don't know that the NRSV is more historically accurate, because it's trying to translate a text that has its own accuracy or inaccuracy when it comes to its relationship to actual history. But I think the NRSV is one of the better ones at striking a balance between readability and carrying across as much of the form and sense of the source text as is advisable for a translation from ancient texts, but also is scholarly in the sense that it takes seriously updates regarding how we're interpreting things, updates and how we understand ancient Greek and ancient Hebrew, as well as where the scholarship stands on the manuscripts and things like that. So the NRSV is going to pull out those 16 or 17 verses from the New Testament that text critical scholars are now confident were not original to the text, whereas other translations are not going to. In fact, I made a video today that I'll probably release tomorrow that talks about how some Bible translations will just put brackets around those New Testament passages, but will leave them in the main body of text, which I think is just an attempt to try to pander to a readership that is going to just lose it if they see a passage missing from their Bible because they don't understand textual criticism. So I think the NRSV does the best job at balancing those considerations. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the most historically accurate, because the biblical text is not particularly historically accurate itself.
Boulder, thank you for your super chat. Do we have any record of other crucifixions in the first half century? Did they have any other ways to execute a rebel?
I'm sure they had a lot of ways to execute rebels. That was probably considered the most conspicuous, the most ignominious, the most shameful way to die. I don't know that we have records of crucifixion from the first half of the first century. We do have some remains. People make a big deal out of the fact that we have a little tomb with some ossuaries. One of them has the name Caiaphas on the side of it, probably the high priest Caiaphas, and there were some nails discovered in association with this tomb. That they had anything to do with the crucifixion, I don't think we can know that, but we have found an ankle bone or two with a nail through it. One of them was actually found in the UK. Another is found in the Holy Land. I think they date to somewhere around the first century. We have a couple of pieces of graffiti that depict crucifixion. One of them is, I think it's Puteoli is the name of the place. It's near Rome. It probably dates to about a century after Jesus's crucifixion, but it depicts a T-shaped cross, and then you have the Alexamenos graffito, which depicts Alexamenos bowing before a cross, where the person on the T-shaped cross has the head of an ass, and it says Alexamenos worships his God, which is supposed to be mocking Christianity. So we have a few things here and there that are indicative of how crucifixion worked, but nothing that gives us enough data to say this is the same time and place as Jesus. We don't have that degree of granularity in the material remains, unfortunately.
Daryl Anderson, thank you for your super chat. Petrosidius, thank you for your super chat. Are the "This is my body" verses from the Last Supper thought by scholars to be from the historical Jesus, or not? And if not, who made that up and why?
The who made it up and why would just be pure speculation. I think it probably arises from a very early, probably communal meal that was enjoyed by Christians when they met together. One of the earliest historical records that we have documenting one of these kinds of meals is Pliny the Younger, who says they gather for a meal before sunrise and then sing hymns to Jesus as if to a god. And the idea of the sacrament seems to be picking up on some then conventional ideas about mystery religions and other groups gathering for meals. and this goes back very, very far. You would gather before the deity to break bread, basically. I don't think the "this is my body" passages go back to historical Jesus. I think that's probably just trying to narratively authorize this practice that probably developed shortly after Jesus's death, and again probably derives from these practices that were common in other mystery cults and things like that, where you gathered together and in some way commemorated the life, or in this case the death, of the divine being through some kind of ritual meal.
Daryl Anderson, thank you for your super chat. What is the consensus regarding the events in Acts 2 regarding Pentecost?
I don't think there is a lot of historicity to those events. I think most scholars would say this is an attempt to try to pull this passage from the Hebrew Bible and suggest that this was a fulfillment of that passage. But yeah, I don't know that any scholars would say that, yeah, we can be confident, or we think that this actually is a record of this event that really happened, where it got really windy all of a sudden and then everybody could suddenly speak a bunch of different languages. That does not have any of the no echoes of historicity to that account.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. How would you define minimal historicity? How many facts do we think we know as critical scholars?
I don't think we can quantify it that way, just because facts can easily bleed into other facts, and if we wanted to, we could also compartmentalize them and divide them up into a bunch of different facts. But minimal historicity, so what I'm thinking of is Habermas's arguments for the resurrection with his minimal facts theory, which is basically just saying, coming up with either 6 or 7, I forget the exact number, 6 or 7 facts or claims about events in the life of Jesus that he suggests 90% or more of scholars agree are likely historical. And they have to do with, the fact that Jesus was crucified, the fact that followers shortly after his death reported seeing him alive, and that kind of stuff. I think there are not a ton. I would quibble with some of Habermas's account, but for the most part, what I've talked about here, that Jesus was probably an itinerant apocalyptic preacher, came from Galilee, from Nazareth most likely, and probably caused a disturbance in the temple, probably was arrested by Rome, probably with the help of some informants on the inside of the Jewish circles in which Jesus ran, or next to which Jesus ran. Probably was crucified and probably had reports circulating shortly after his death of people seeing him. If you want to count those as facts, I don't know how many that was, but I think that's about as minimalist as we can get.
Shane Montgomery, thank you for your super chat. When you say scholars agree, to whom you refer?
I'm generally referring to the majority position of the scholars who have published research in this area. So not necessarily anybody who claims to be a Bible scholar. Those opinions, while I think they are valid, I don't think they're as weighty as the opinions of scholars who've actually published in the area. And so it would be nice if there were a Wikipedia for biblical scholarly consensuses, where we could just go see an updated tally of who agrees with what. We don't have anything like that. And so scholars, what they do is they read as widely as they can on given research questions. And then when you have done that and you have read everything that you can find on something, then you know what position is advocated for by the majority of scholars. And there are diachronic and synchronic considerations. You have to think about, well, there were, back in the 80s, a lot more people thought this. Now, a lot more people are thinking this. But suddenly I'm seeing all these scholars within the last 3 years who are now saying this. So it's a moving target. But I published a paper on Psalm 82 back in 2018 in the Journal of Biblical Literature. And I had to track down every single publication I could that addressed Psalm 82. not because I wanted to be able to say this is the consensus view, but because I wanted to make sure nobody beat me to the punch, and that if somebody said something that significantly helped or significantly hurt my argument, I wanted to be aware of it, because the last thing you want to do is publish something and then have somebody out there go, you moron, you completely missed this publication over here, and that completely obliterates your argument, or something like that. So scholars have to read as widely as they can, and in the process of doing that, you're going to say, hey, I've read pretty much everything that's been published on this specific question, and the majority of scholars say this. And I'm trying to read as widely as I can. Nobody can be an expert on all the different research questions, but I'm trying to find the consensuses on as many different questions as I can.
Jesus Tales, thank you for your super chat. I do enjoy your shows and have seen quite a few. Have Bible scholars figured out what Harry Potter actually did based on the stories about him?
So this sounds like a frequent criticism that I receive, that being a scholar of the Bible or having a PhD in the Bible is the same as being a scholar of Harry Potter or having a PhD in Harry Potter, which must sound devastatingly clever to folks who don't pay much attention to the world around them. But the Bible is the single most influential text that has ever existed, and people live and die because of the contents of that text every single day all around the world, and understanding it better is an unqualified good. So yeah, I trying to understand how the world works better and how the most influential text in the world works better, trying to frame that as a bad thing is just laughably misguided, if that is what that commenter is trying to get at. And if that's not what they're trying to get at, then I wholeheartedly apologize for misunderstanding, but I sincerely don't understand what the point of the question would be.
My fish in a tie, thank you for your super chat. The latest tests show the inscription on the James Ossuary is 100% authentic, and a geochemistry study has shown it comes from the Tapiat tomb. Thoughts?
I would disagree that the latest tests show it is 100% authentic. It is always going to be arguments about probabilities and likelihoods. And I think there are enough doubts that have been raised by other scholars that we're not going to be able to come down one way or the other and say we have definitively, conclusively demonstrated it is either genuine or a forgery. And in light of the concerns about forgeries and unprovenanced artifacts, I think the majority of scholars are in agreement that until we have at least a probability that the majority of scholars can be comfortable with, it is far better to err on the side of caution and not accept these claims. I myself have some significant concerns with that whole argument, and so I'm not an expert on it. It's not my research focus, but yeah, there are concerns with the notion that this means anything other than, hey, there was this ossuary that was attributed to a guy named, or that was held the bones of Jesus or James or son of Joseph or whatever. There are a few different ossuaries involved, but the specific one I think he's talking about is the Jesus ben Joseph, which I don't know that it reveals much about the historical Jesus anyway, even if the inscription is authentic.
Kyle, thank you for your super chat. I just watched Ehrman talk about Isaiah 46:9 as evidence of monotheism in that era. Isn't it more of a statement of incomparability? Is it both? How has the scholarly consensus on changed over time?
I think this is definitely about comparability, and the Anochi El ve'ein od Elohim ve'esef kamoni, and there is none like me. That's incomparability. Ein od Elohim is there is not another God, and a lot of people think this is an assertion of a philosophical, ontological assertion of uniqueness. And I just don't see any evidence for that. You see this word "ein" being used to refer to the non-existence of things within a specific rhetorical scope. Like if you were in a room and somebody was like, "Hey, is there a sword?" You would say, "Ein, a sword." That doesn't mean no sword exists. It means there's not a sword within the scope of your question. And overwhelmingly, when we look at the there is no other rhetoric in, particularly in Deutero-Isaiah, but anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, the context always seems to be deliverance or salvation. And it's the idea is always no other God saved you, no other God can save you. You owe allegiance to no other God. It's never no other ones exist. It's always when it comes to who's your daddy, basically, there are no others, which I would argue and have argued, and many others have argued as well, asserts a specific rhetorical scope. The idea being no other gods matter to you. And we have very similar claims being put into the mouths of the personified Babylon and Nineveh and Moab, where I think it occurs a couple of times in Isaiah and once in Zephaniah, where these personified cities say, "I am and there is no other." And the rhetorical point there is not that these cities think they're the only cities that exist, is that they think they're the only cities that matter to their inhabitants. Just like and Nathan MacDonald's got a wonderful book, Deuteronomy and the Meaning of Monotheism, that goes into detail about this rhetoric as it's found in Deuteronomy and talks about how this is not about exclusivity of existence, but exclusivity of relationship. So no, I don't think that's evidence of monotheism.
K-Fly-esque, thank you for your super chat. Hello, Dan, huge fan. I have a BA in philosophy and a JD. I want to learn more about our scriptures so that I have a better understanding of context, interpretation, etc. What do you recommend?
First thing I would recommend is John Barton's book, A History of the Bible, the book and its faiths. John Barton is my Dr. Grossvater. In other words, he was the doctoral supervisor of my doctoral supervisor. He is an Anglican priest and an Oxford scholar. And this is a phenomenal introduction to an academic, a scholarly approach to the Bible. And in addition to being, I think, the best introduction to the history of the Bible, how it came together, how it was canonized, as well as how it has historically been read by the two main ideological groups that have inherited it, the Judaism and Christianity, there's a ton of bibliographic data as well that you can mine, because you're going to, as you read through it, I think there will be things that you'll find fascinating and you'll want to go look up more about that. And so there is a decent bibliography in here and plenty of helpful notes as well. So that's probably the first thing I would recommend. I would recommend a good study Bible. The SBL Study Bible, I think, is the best one available at the moment. The 6th edition of the New Oxford Annotated Bible will probably be out in a year or two, and I think that will probably become my favorite study Bible as soon as that comes out. If you want to get deep into commentaries, that can be expensive, and they can be pretty technical. But I think that's an even better way to be able to drill down to the bedrock of individual passages and things like that. My favorite commentary series are Hermeneia, the Anchor Yale Bible commentary series, International Critical Commentary series, and the Old and New Testament libraries. And then, of course, you also want to pre-order my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues, which is also going to be full of some wonderful bibliographic information, but primarily is going to be walking through different claims about what the Bible says and then talking about what the data indicate regarding whether or not the Bible actually says those things. And do you have a copy of that yet, Jacob?
I do.
Awesome. Yep. I know I'm looking forward to getting something on the schedule with you so that we can discuss that once the publisher allows me to because they've got a strict schedule they want to keep to. So that's what I would recommend to start with. And if you do those things, you're going to find a lot of other stuff that you're going to find a lot of tangents, you're going to find a lot of bibliographic information, and you're going to have plenty of resources to keep you busy for a long, long time.
MedJ Mike, thank you for your super chat. Has Dan read any of John Dominic Crossan's material? What does he think of his conclusions about a more social justice / nonviolent resistance motivation?
I have read some of John Dominic Crossan's stuff. It was a while ago though, and I think as that was a part of an earlier phase in the search for the historical Jesus, and so different set of methodologies. I think it was useful in its time. I think it is quite outdated at this point, and so I'm not as confident as John probably has been about some of the conclusions that he reaches. I would love the idea of a more social justice, nonviolent resistance Jesus. I think that's remaking Jesus a little bit in our own image when we do that. I think there is certainly a degree to which Jesus is represented in the Gospels as being one of the social justice warriors that is, repeating the prophetic critique rhetoric that from Hosea 6:6, the "I will have mercy and not sacrifice" thing, which we only find in Matthew, but we find repeated twice in there. I'm sure the historical Jesus, as an apocalyptic itinerant preacher, was advocating for the poor and the orphan and the widow and the oppressed. That is, that's part of that whole genre of preaching. But the degree to which it would align with what we understand as social justice today or nonviolent resistance today, I'm not so convinced about that. Even though I would love it if we could discover hippie BLM Jesus, but I think that would just be remaking Jesus in our own image, at least in the image of some of us.
Mr. Warlife, thank you for your super chat. Once crucifixion meant any execution on wood, such as poles and impaling in Assyria and Persia, but which civilization started the nailing to a cross?
In Assyria and Persia, they would have used different words to refer to impaling. And the English word crucifixion doesn't come along till long after that. So I don't know that we could say that there was a time when crucifixion referred to any kind of impaling. I think it is in English always referred to what we know as Roman crucifixion. So it's Rome that innovated what we know now today as crucifixion. And a lot of people will point to the fact that the Greek word is stavros, which can mean just a pole. So a lot of folks point to the Jehovah's Witnesses who visualize Jesus being nailed to a vertical pole rather than two crossed planks or poles. But the earliest evidence that we have for crucifixion in first century Rome points in the direction of the T-shaped cross. Like I pointed to the graffito. I think the name of the place, the location was Puteoli, but it could be something else. And then with the Alexamenos graffito, both of those depict somebody on a T-shaped cross with their arms outstretched. And the references to Jesus's arms being outstretched and things like that are suggestive that that's closer to probably what happened than the idea of him being impaled or being hung on a pole or strung up on a tree or anything like that.
Daniel Alpern, thank you for your super chat. Was doubting Thomas likely historical or an add-on?
I personally think there probably was a disciple named Thomas in the early years of Christianity, but the story about doubting Thomas and saying I won't believe until I see, that doesn't sound very historical to me, but it would not surprise me if it goes back to a historical kernel where there was a prominent follower of Jesus, who after Jesus's death was not quick to accept the stories being circulated about him appearing to others. Whether or not the historical doubting Thomas just rejected the idea outright and that was the end of that, or actually came around in the end, if it was historical at all, we couldn't say. But I think I would be most confident concluding that there probably was a disciple named Thomas who perhaps was more skeptical than the others in the aftermath of Jesus's execution.
Jesse Greenewald, thank you for your super chat. Dan, you mentioned Jesus Before the Gospels isn't considered a great book. Do you have any book recommendations on oral transmission? And I just want to say something real quick. I enjoyed the book personally. But,
yeah, I enjoyed it too. The criticisms of it actually come from an old professor of mine who specializes in memory studies. So, and the fact that he doesn't like it is not reflective of a scholarly consensus or anything like that. But on oral transmission, one of the books that I read as a part of this professor's class was Orality and Literacy by Walter Ong, which is from the 70s, so it's quite outdated. But there have been a handful of books that have been published on social memory and the historical Jesus. I'm trying to think of one of them. There was another book we read in his class. I want to say Kirk and Thatcher. Yeah. So, but this is also not incredibly up to date. It's from 2005. Memory, Tradition, and Text: Uses of the Past in Early Christianity, edited by Alan Kirk and Tom Thatcher. So that's an edited volume, a collection of papers that are going to discuss social memory, oral transmission, and stuff like that. That's probably going to be one of the more recent publications that I have experience with that deal directly with that issue. But let me just see if, well, no, we got some more recent stuff. Well, these are papers. Jens Schroeder, Memory, Theories of History and the Reception of Jesus from 2018, and the Journal for the Study of the Historical Jesus is a paper, but that's going to have bibliographic information if you want to track down monographs on this. Yeah, most of the memory studies I'm looking at or that I have read actually have to do with the Hebrew Bible rather than Jesus. And that, well, let me just peek at one more. Yeah, that's about Deuteronomy. So yeah, most of them have to do with the Hebrew Bible.
Brian, thank you for your super chat. How do you see AI being leveraged in biblical scholarship?
In good ways and bad ways. I think AI probably has the potential to be incredibly helpful for research projects, because for a long time you've had to just pump your advisor or try to find whatever you can on that has been written on a given topic. But now that you have AI that can help point you in the direction of research, I think that can be phenomenally helpful. I've read all these on this research question. Is there anything I'm missing? Or who has published on this question in the last 20 years? The only problem is you do get a lot of hallucinations, and particularly with ChatGPT, where it just makes stuff up. You could be like, name 10 sources that address this question, and you can be like, I've never heard of 8 of those, and you go look them up, and it's like one of them was real, the other 7 don't even exist at all. They just ChatGPT just totally made it up. So anything that you are any kind of research you're doing using AI, verify everything. Don't ever hang anything on the testimony of AI. You always got to go verify. And I've been surprised by how much more robust Grok has been than ChatGPT. I don't know how much you use AI, Jacob, but I've found that when I go verify the things that they're talking about, Grok is a lot more accurate than ChatGPT has been, which disappoints me. but that's where the data lead. And then, yeah, hopefully it's going to influence Bible translation for good or for bad. It's going to influence Bible translation. I'm a little wary of it, but hopefully the people who are forging ahead with that are going to be responsible and are going to ensure that it's increasing quality rather than just increasing speed.
Ronan Nostag, thank you for your super chat. Biblicopedia, let's go. Who's got the server space to start this?
that would be a pretty cool project. I I'm talking with my podcast co-host about looking for some opportunities to get some grants. And a project like that would be a pretty fun one to go see if we can get grant money for.
Sketchy Getchy, thank you for your super chat. Were Levi and Matthew separate characters when talking about the tax collectors, according to scholars?
That's a great question. Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew is the only one that refers to the tax collector as Matthew, and this is one of the reasons that some scholars think they chose to attribute that Gospel to Matthew. We don't know. The practice of having two names is not unheard of in that time period, so maybe that's what's going on there. Maybe there was a separate tax collector. I think I personally, and probably most of the scholars I know, would say we don't have enough data to falsify the notion that these were just different names for the same person. I don't know that that we could say much more than that.
Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. Was the Toth symbol used for the cross design?
Why was the Tau symbol used for the cross design? You have a couple different ones where the cross beam is at the very top, and then another one where the cross beam is like a lowercase t rather than an uppercase t. I don't know that there's any reason beyond the fact that it was a convenient shape. Hey, we need the arms to do something else. Put another beam going across, and tie or lash or nail the arms to that. I don't know that it went beyond that. I certainly don't have any information about any special significance of the appearance of a cross like a tau.
Didymus, thank you for your super chat. Were most Jews in that time buried underground?
So there would have been the most common kind of grave that has been preserved to us are what are known as the Chochim or Kochim style tombs, which would have been a central chamber, and then there would have been niches, burial niches or Kochim carved into the walls, radiating out from that. These would not have been, most of these would have been family tombs, and probably for middle to upper class families. We don't really know about what the lower class folks did. They might have just, dug a hole, put them in the ground, and we don't have any materials preserved to be able to identify burials. But if they had a Kochim style tomb, then they would have set the corpse in the niche until the flesh had all deteriorated and it was just bones. They would have gathered up the bones. They would have put them either in a repository under the tombs. That's more common in the Iron Age, or more likely for first century CE Judea, they would have put them in an ossuary, a bone box, and then the bone box would get stuffed into the niche, and then those would have filled up over time. But in the Iron Age, the repository would have, ultimately you would have a pile of bones down there. And some scholars think that the idea of being gathered to your ancestors refers to that, your bones being gathered and chucked into the pile of your ancestors' bones, where you are no longer individuated. You have become one with the mass of bones that constitute your ancestors.
My Fishnet Tie, thank you for your super chat. Thoughts on the Christian hotel with the Christian's inscription and cross in Seder Square in Pompeii from the baker's house and Crossan Herculaneum?
I think that there's, I don't know a ton about the use of the cross in this time period within the Greco-Roman world. I've seen a lot of reports of crosses as a salient symbol outside of Christianity. I'd have to look more into that, but bread can only have so many designs in it if you want to put designs in bread, and I think simple geometric shapes like crosses probably were incredibly common, and whether that is a coincidence or maybe there was maybe certainly Christianity would have made its way to Italy by that time period, or maybe one of the reasons that the cross was able to spread so quickly was because it did bear such remarkable similarity to pretty standard geometric shapes. I don't know. That is an interesting question that I should learn more about.
Yeah, just a couple more super chats.
All right.
Smell, thank you for your super chat. What is the probability Mark is mostly based on oration performance having got written down and fleshed out a bit?
I think that's probably most likely. I don't know if it was an oral performance that only secondarily was written down. I imagine that the performance developed along with kind of a script for it. I've talked to Candida Moss on my podcast about the idea that like the long ending of Mark could have been added by someone who was performing it and just riffing and just engage in some ad hoc literary creativity. Her book, God's Ghostwriters, talks a little bit about the role of enslaved folks in transcribing the Gospels, and particularly Mark. So, yeah, I think there's a high likelihood that Mark was intended to be performed initially, and that the performance is probably responsible for some of the innovations and additions that developed over the centuries, or well, over the decades. Anyway.
Mr. Warlight, thank you for your super chat. Can you debate Amon Hillman on modern day debate?
No, I don't. I've been invited to debate a few different people. I'm not really a believer in debates. I think it's more performative identity politics than anything else. I prefer to take the time to take the arguments seriously and think about them and look up sources and ponder things. I think that's a much more respectful way to approach disagreements. But yeah, when it comes to things like whether or not the Hebrew Bible was originally written in Greek and things like that, there's nothing to debate there. That would be a waste of my time to imagine that there's a debate to be had there.
Last super chat. Ronan of Stag. Thank you for your super chat. The cross inspired by the Ankh, please. Yay, nay.
I am disinclined to see a genetic relationship between the Ankh and the cross. Certainly not outside the realm of possibility, but the fact that one kind of resembles the other is not evidence enough for me that one was inspired by the other.
I'd like to go back to Q and
Yeah.
Josephus for a moment. And so if Q exists and it's a common source for Matthew and Luke, is it a collection? Would it contain collections of sayings of Jesus that are, some of them are authentic and some of them are not authentic, or would you doubt the whole thing?
I would probably start from the assumption that none of them are authentic, but be willing to be convinced. But I think we would need a lot more data than we currently have available to us to be able to authenticate any of the sayings that we find in Q, because ostensibly we have the sayings that we find in Q in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and we don't have enough data to be able to authenticate any of those. So yeah, if Q does exist, then it is something that has had 50-ish years to turn into whatever it was by the time the authors of Matthew and Luke got their hands on it. So who knows what the relationship is to actual commentary from Jesus. And another thing to keep in mind is that there's a reason we don't have Gospels written down till decades afterwards, and why the agrapha, the unwritten words of Jesus, were considered to be just as authoritative, if not more authoritative, than the written words of Jesus, and why Jesus himself seems to prioritize oral messages over the written word. And that's because if you expect everything to the whole world to end within weeks or months or years, but imminently, there's not really a reason to write things down. It's not for posterity. And so I don't think any of them saw a need to write any of this down. And it probably wasn't until after Jesus' death that people were like, oh, I should have written that down. And we started seeing things written down, which gives you an opportunity to create and to expand on and to innovate. And then, the first generation of Christians, they probably valued more the stories of the words of Jesus from people who were there to hear them in person than they valued the dead letters. And the Jewish scriptures were probably considered less authoritative than the words of Jesus because they were dead letters rather than living words. And it was probably not until you got another generation away from Jesus and nobody really had a plausible claim to having heard Jesus's words in person that we start to see people going, we better write this down. We need to start we need to start circulating the texts. And that probably dovetails with the desire to spread the gospel more widely than one individual can take it, and so textual transmission became the preferred mode decades after Jesus's death. That's my opinion, anyway.
I now want to ask about how mythicists will approach this. Like when they'll say, "Oh, you don't know Q exists," and then it's like, "Okay, you take away Q, that somehow damages the historicist position. Knock out the testimonium out of Josephus and assume the whole thing was added later. A total interpolation." And they think that they think by doing that they've knocked down a couple of blows on the historicist in the boxing ring. What do you think about that?
I don't think that does much, and I think the argument is not incredibly strong for it, because in one way or another we've got to come up with an argument for how the data got to be the way they are, and if you skip over the argument to just begin from the presupposition of the non-existence of Jesus, which is quite common, you still have to connect the dots, and I have just not seen a plausible argument for how you go from the tradition of Jesus just being a complete ex nihilo invention of a small group of people to the texts and the traditions in all of their pluriformity that we have a handful of decades later. It's not outside the realm of possibility, but when we consider side by side the explanations that have been provided for how the mythicists, or not the mythicists, but how the people who created Jesus just ginned him up out of thin air, how we get from there to Paul and the Gospels and all that, it's just not nearly as plausible as the explanation that a bunch of people scrambled to try to salvage their worldview after an itinerant apocalyptic preacher that they all followed was executed. It just makes infinitely more sense than the just fabrication of this character. And so even without Josephus, that's not that's not a huge arrow in the quiver of the argument. It's a factor, but I don't, it doesn't, it's not one of the pillars of the argument. And at the same time, you can get rid of the Testimonium Flavianum if you want. There's still the other reference to Jesus, and just dismissing both of them as interpolations is not supported by an awful lot of data. That is a dogma just in search of an argument, and I have yet to see a convincing argument for why we should reject the reference to the execution of James, who was the brother of Jesus, whom they called Christ.
And then they'll go to the 7 authentic letters of Paul, and they'll say that, oh, when you read Paul, there's no indication that Jesus was crucified on earth. He was he never made it to earth. He got crucified in heaven or the firmament, somewhere around there.
Yeah. And you can point to the passages about him being born of a woman, and they're like, oh, that's an interpolation. And every passage that is inconvenient to your argument can be dismissed as an interpolation if you're just performing for a group that already agrees. But the evidence for interpolation is no good. And you get to cosmic sperm banks where the Davidic sperm is being cosmically preserved for centuries, and the amount of scenarios that you have to gin up that are not in evidence just makes Occam's razor blush. It's just, yeah, the height of silliness, the lengths you have to go to try to connect the dots of Jesus didn't exist to the data that we have in these different texts and in this following. And I'm not as much of a positivist as Bart. I will say, yeah, we can be certain he exists. What I will say is that it is more likely than not that he exists. I think it's significantly more likely than not, but I don't think I would say that we can be certain. So, and by that I mean that I don't think that the mythicist position is entirely without any kind of rationality at all. I just think it's less likely, significantly less likely, and the arguments that have been conjured up in defense of it, I overwhelmingly find pretty silly.
One more thing I want to ask about the mythicist take on Paul is he'll say, "Oh, James being called the Lord's brother in Galatians is that doesn't mean anything because other people in Paul's letters were called brother of the Lord. So it's just a title. It's not. He's not really his brother."
There are. It's not just a title. We have. Oh gosh, now I'm forgetting the passages, but there are a handful of passages that make clear that that the brother relationship between Jesus and James and the others is not reducible to just an honorific. And I think Bart makes the strongest case for that in his, and I think it's actually in, yeah, it's his "Did Jesus Exist" book. He talks at some length about why, about the passages that show that. And I apologize, I cannot remember off the top of my head the passages that that are indicative of this being quite explicitly an actual biological relationship. Yeah, there's Bart's book from 2012. I just have it in PDF form. I don't have a hard copy. These are all just for show. I do everything digitally these days. That's just a joke, by the way. But I do most of this digitally.
We do have a super chat. I'll just take this one real quick before we close. Solovino, thank you for your super chat. You often seem to criticize others for presupposing something. However, wouldn't you say that we all have to presuppose something?
Yeah, there are absolutely degrees to which we all have to make assumptions. My critiques are for presuppositions that people will assert over and against the data. Because if I'm presupposing something and somebody points it out, I think I've shown many times that I'm willing to go reconsider those things. There are some things that there's an attempt on the part of some apologists to kind of retreat to epistemological uncertainty as if that's some kind of trump card that you then have to default to the texts are all inerrant. I get that an awful lot, and I don't think you're talking about that. But yeah, there's an awful lot of history where we're relying on assumptions, or we're relying on arguments that we have not made, arguments that we may not have heard, but have resulted in pretty secure consensus views. But yeah, presupposition is pretty natural, and I think we can't avoid presupposition, we can't avoid bias entirely. But what we must be able to do is confront it when we find it in our own arguments or when it's pointed out by others. And we have to be able to make a case for it. And I don't think that I've been called out for presupposing something that I have not either, one, abandoned, or two, been able to rationally defend as a presupposition. For instance, in my book, Adonai's Divine Images, in the beginning I talk about how I'm going to use empirical data from the cognitive science of religion, which is which is based almost entirely on experimentation with living informants. And I'm going to use that to draw conclusions about the cognitive architecture of minds that functioned 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And I say in the introduction to the book, obviously this presupposes that there is the difference between 3,000-year-old human minds versus the human minds of living informants that we are testing today is negligible and doesn't impact my conclusions. We don't really have any data that falsify that. That is a presupposition, though. And so should we someday arrive at presupposition, or should we someday find data that help us verify or falsify that, then, maybe my argument changes. But we're not at a point really right now where we can do either. And so that's the kind of presupposition that I will engage in, one that is rational, makes sense to me, and we can't really falsify. And when you look at cognitive neuroscience, evolutionary psychology, cognitive science of religion, all that kind of stuff, that is overwhelmingly agreed upon by pretty much all the scholars involved. So that's the kind of presupposition that I will make and I'm generally comfortable with. But if somebody identifies presuppositions that I'm making that are not supported or are falsifiable by the data, hopefully I am happy to abandon them. I've done that in the past. If I'm missing something right now, by all means, let me know.
And before we close, here's my copy of your book.
Oh, wow.
The green screen's kind of interfering.
Oh, the green screen. I was like, oh, it's embossed and everything, but no, I guess it's just the green screen.
But here
we go. All right, yeah. The advanced reader copy. Well, have you started reading it yet?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
A little, okay. Yeah. No, don't worry. I'm not offended if you haven't, because I still have books that have been sent to me that I haven't started reading. Well, I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to talking to you about it. And anybody out there watching, the pre-order now, so that I can get a second one started as soon as this one comes out. And so
I'll put the link in the description.
Oh, awesome! Thank you.
Yeah,
and then I can get the publisher to send me on a book signing tour. Right now, I'm going to be working with my podcast co-host to do some live events in a few different places around the country that will and we'll collaborate with the publisher. But yeah, they're not throwing a ton of money at us yet. They're not sending us to London yet. So that's the goal, though. Get me to London.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dan.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.